My name is Jason Langoni. I run our AI business here at Nutanix. It was actually a super early employee way back 2011, running our US federal business once upon a time. Did an 8-year run at Nutanix, left for 4 years, did a generative AI SaaS company, learned a lot, and we'll talk about some of those learnings today. But again, I'm thrilled to be back at Nutanix as we have seen such a great demand for supporting generative AI initiatives with our customers along with Choice. So I'm just going to start here. I mean, I always say, a company has made it when my mom knows who they are. And, earlier this year, NVIDIA became one of the most valuable companies on the planet, which probably doesn't surprise anybody here. They became valuable one because they're shipping just an enormous amount of GPUs, and GPUs are, the horsepower for most of these generative AI, if not all of these generative AI initiatives across healthcare and banking and other organizations, but also because of the transformative value businesses are seeing when they start to adopt generative AI. And we'll talk about some of those use cases today. So to me, it's important to note that it's not just because NVIDIA is, making the best GPUs available, shipping the best GPUs available, but they're also helping companies truly transform through the use of generative AI. And so maybe just we'll start here, just so we're all on the same page. Predictive AI has been around for a very long time. Depending on who you ask, they'll say, many decades. But, the gist of predictive AI is taking a large data set, understanding or recognizing a pattern, and being able to find anomalies or outliers within the pattern. Fraud detection is a very good example of predictive AI. Generative AI, clearly, which is in every podcast. It's all over my LinkedIn feed. It's on the radio in the morning. It's in my news. Is all about using AI to generate some type of content, whether it's video, whether it's a report, whether it's, a music file. But it's using AI to now actually produce and generate content, ideally of value. Click the right spot. So Gartner's got a ton of great reports. I mean, most of the analysts do, but I've really found that Gartner's done a really good job, as we're kind of in these early days of generative AI. This was a report they published, I want to say 4 to 6 months ago, where through their research, they state that generative AI is now the most, commonly deployed AI solution in the enterprise. Again, that's compared with predictive AI. And again, it's probably not surprising to anybody here. What might be surprising is they also stated through their research that essentially quantifying the business value is the number one barrier to adoption. So it's not figuring out, hey, do I need an L40S or an L4 or an H100 GPU? It's not figuring out what model. It's not figuring out what vector database. It's having a specific business challenge that you can quantify the value of when you solve. So, I know when we're in the field with Choice, and Brian summed it up great kind of in the opening, that it's really about positive business outcomes, understanding what are we trying to accomplish together, how do we start to quantify, the value of overcoming that challenge or opening up a new capability, because ultimately that's what it's all about. And we certainly follow that same guidance and pathway here at Nutanix. And I'm going to encourage everybody here to do so as well. LinkedIn's a treasure trove of anecdotes. I mean, it's also fairly noisy, so you're gonna have to sift through that a little bit. This was a post from the CEO of Moderna 8 months ago, I want to say 6 to 8 months ago, somewhere in that time range, where he was talking about the ways they have started to use generative AI. And I won't go through all of them here, but you can really start to see some of the value. Contract GPT, this notion of being able to upload a potential contract that your procurement team's going to sign or legal's going to sign, and having the generative AI process that contract versus all of the historical contracts you've ever signed to understand, hey, is this going to align with something that we're going to be able to green light? Even make suggestions when it finds maybe clauses that aren't acceptable, make suggestions of the red line edits themselves. I mean, and even so, something as I think kind of standard as that, all the way to prepping for earnings calls, which I thought was pretty creative. But we are seeing, again, whether it's healthcare agencies, still do a lot with the federal government. Um, as long as there's a specific challenge, you can typically understand and start to architect a way to solve that challenge through generative AI. So let's talk about the most common use cases that we are seeing in the field. And some of these use cases, at least the first two, candidly, we see every day. I'm probably in, I'll say, an average of 6 customer calls a day around the world, and we see some of these just repeatedly. And the first use case is this notion of a private GPT, essentially something like Chat GPT, where everything is on-prem. The model's on-prem, the engine serving up the model, the infrastructure running everything, including the GPUs and the prompts and the logs and the output. Everything is contained on-prem, where you have people that want to be able to ask a question, to a multi-purpose large language model and start to get answers back. And maybe a good example of how I use this pretty often is I'll use it to give me a draft agenda for meetings because when we're setting meetings internally, I'm kind of a stickler. Like, what's the agenda for the meeting? Like, just don't drop an invite on my calendar. Like, what are we trying to accomplish? And so I use an internal private GPT here at Nutanix to help me put together a good agenda so I look a little more professional. The next kind of evolution in that kind of initial use case is now being able to ask the artificial intelligence a question, and instead of getting kind of a polished but generic answer back from the large language model, now I want that artificial intelligence to be aware of maybe a repository of documents and PDF files, maybe data that I have living in a database. So when I ask a question, now I'm getting an answer back with context, with domain knowledge. So it's not just a generic answer. Now it's custom and specific to my line of business, to my company, maybe even my geography or the country that I'm working in. Commonly known as, RAG, retrieval augmented generation. Again, you'll see a lot of content on this use case, no matter where you're scrolling for news. But these two use cases right here, yeah, I'm fairly confident in saying everyone will do them or is doing them in the next 12 months. We've helped a lot already in this calendar year. We've got a lot of projects on the slate around the world, and it's just a very common, and I'll say kind of low risk, and we'll talk about risk in a second, but a low risk way to start unlocking transformative value, through generative AI, using the lovely GPUs from NVIDIA. So those are the first two. If you had to remember two use cases, those would be it. The other use cases that we see, this third one, which is the notion of a private copilot, essentially for developers. So, imagine an organization has some team, small, medium, large, of developers that crank out code to deliver a capability to internal employees, to their customers, to partner organizations, to government entity. But they're part of their business is shipping code. So there are SaaS offerings that help a developer type in a prompt, hey, give me a Java function that can go scrape ESPN.com and give me the Knicks schedule for the year and calculate win probability. So you do have that capability in SaaS, but there's a lot of organizations, especially in healthcare, regulated industries, where they see that capability up in the public cloud or via SaaS offering, but legal, compliance, security won't let them use it. So, we've been helping those customers deploy a private copilot on-prem so their developers can tap into, again, that transformative productivity that allows them to, one, refactor legacy code that maybe they didn't write, was in COBOL, maybe they never learned COBOL. Hey, can you translate that into modern day English to understand what this function's doing? Great. Now I get what it's doing. Now can you refactor that into Java or Python or some other language for me? So we see that again, the organization has to have some team of developers for that to make sense. And then again, going back to a point Brian opened up with, which is delivering positive business outcomes around a specific challenge. We certainly come across organizations who have a specific challenge. There's not an easy, off the shelf generative AI solution that can be deployed to meet that challenge. So now they've decided that, hey, this is highly valuable. We've quantified, at least partially what this value could look like to the organization, but we're going to have to build a generative AI capability. And that's typically done through, NVIDIA AI enterprise stack or Data Robot, Domino, any number of platforms. And again, I have it as the fourth use case. It certainly comes up often with more mature organizations in their generative AI journey. But as long as there's a specific business challenge identified and we can start to quantify the value, the use case also makes sense. I can't see the Q&A box, so if there are questions, if someone just wants to shout, and Oz, if you've got any gems along the way, please don't be shy.
Sure, man. I didn't want to take your camera at all, so I was debating whether to come on or off. Hi on
Oh,
the.
all good. You got the better background.
Yeah, yeah. I don't like the blur. Tells a story.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. So, we've talked a little bit about the primary use cases. And again, those top two we see every single day. Doesn't really matter the vertical, the company size, the country that they're doing business in. We see those two use cases very often. The next is deciding where you're ultimately going to run your generative AI applications, your Gen AI infrastructure. Clearly, public cloud is an option. We see a lot of folks prototype there. And I will just kind of distill it down to from a Nutanix perspective and an NVIDIA perspective, we got an offering that supports public and private cloud. So I can't say it matters a ton either way there. What I will say, though, and probably the biggest lesson I learned when I was at the generative AI startup is I was amazed how many times legal jumped into our project late, kind of in the planning stages before kickoff and said, "Oh, you're not running that up in AWS or Azure or GCP. Like we need this stuff on-prem. The liability exposure is too great. We need absolute control." And then you see headlines like this as well, whether it's, the Times suing OpenAI over use of their data to train a model, or UMG, Getty, you name it. But there's a lot of concern on, hey, the data that we feed the generative AI application and that we provide to the model, or the questions we ask, will that be used to improve that model that maybe our competitors are also using? Is it possible for someone to know how to ask the right question to uncover our bit of data found within that model? So there's definitely a lot of concerns there, and rightfully so. I thought this was a really nice kind of quote and guidance from MIT, Sloan School of Management, where they're saying, hey, you should really think of, models and the data, the prompts, the logs, the applications. All of this is extremely valuable IP. We're in the early days of this emerging generative AI era. It very much, there's a bunch of good articles out there and like the haves and the have-nots of those that adopt this technology. But there is a lot of value, even in just understanding, let's say you deploy a private GPT internally, in understanding what your employees are asking. Maybe that unlocks an opportunity to go build a capability that makes them more efficient doing a particular task. So again, MIT is recommending, really view this as valuable IP. You want absolute control and visibility over all of this. And for most organizations, whether they're in a regulated industry or not, that's going to mean a private cloud deployment. We could spend an hour on this topic. I'm a pretty simple person. I like to distill AI, and I would encourage you to kind of distill your thinking of AI down to this, that AI is just software that runs in containers. Yeah, there's a lot of cool technology under the covers, but when you think about it operationally, from an IT perspective, and if you think of it that, okay, ultimately AI is just a software application that's running in a container, or, a cluster of containers. And yes, it's true that that software needs access to GPUs from NVIDIA. You need some kind of enterprise Kubernetes management so you can manage these containers at scale. You need storage for structured and unstructured data. You need models. You need to serve up the models. Um, but I think it allows you to start to grapple operationally with what it will mean to deploy generative AI in your organization. A couple of things that maybe a lot of people don't talk about, ultimately AI or this software running in containers, it's living on infrastructure somewhere. So you still need to maintain hardware. And I know that's not glamorous, but I can tell you with the customers that were early adopters with Nutanix over the last year, we've seen the rate at which they're expanding their generative AI environments. And again, understanding how to manage at scale, both the container level, the Kubernetes level, as well as the hardware level is important. And then the last thing that I really think, is worth spending some time thinking through internally within your organization is how heavy of a lift is it to run generative AI on a particular platform or on a particular infrastructure? And that's one of the areas and one of the talk tracks, Nutanix and Choice has out in the field with our customers is look, especially if you've been a Nutanix customer for the past year or 5 years or 10 years, and you've been happy running and operating virtual machines on a Nutanix environment. Well, hey, guess what? We're going to deliver that same delightful experience for containers, even if those containers are running AI software, and talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I do think it's really important that, you want to start to adopt generative AI because it will transform not just the value you see out of certain areas within, line of business within your organization. It'll transform how you operate in a very positive way. But it's also important to think of how are we going to run this infrastructure? Is it going to become a burden? Do we have to send all of our IT department out to get, new skills and new certifications, or can we run on a platform that has made this as easy as possible so we can focus just on the value and maybe the people process part of our organization?